Thank you so much, Boris, for this eulogy. And the day when I die, I think I'll call on you to make sure that you are around. So thank you so much for bringing us together. Thank you for carrying the flag year after year and celebrating the 30th anniversary. Philip was telling me that it gets better every year, so I don't know what else you will invent for next year after this fantastic conference, but also the tremendous singers that we enjoyed all so much. So thank you very, very much. For those of you who are not too interested in my speech, I encourage you to look at the beauty of the scene, because that's also the reason why we all come here. Dubrovnik is not just you, Boris, and all your team, but it's also the beauty of the setting that you have selected and the beauty of your country. So in your honor, Boris, I'm going to quote a very famous poet from Croatia, Ivan Gundulic. And just for you and your Croatian team members, O lijepa, o draga, o slatka slobodo. Okay, for the non-Croatian around the table, oh beautiful, oh dear, oh sweet freedom. And I think in the context of what we are living at the moment, particularly in this corner of the world, in Europe, to celebrate freedom in the way he did is something that is very important. And I would like to, on this occasion, salute our Ukrainian friend and celebrate your courage. Yes, I know. That's for him that I said that. Thank you. Yeah. And it's for you as well. Second round of applause for you. So your program, Boris, offers a snapshot of policymaking in a world of transition. And this world of transition is increasingly a world of profound uncertainty for us economic policymakers. If you look back at speeches of former central bankers, and I'm sure some of you really enjoy that exercise occasionally, policymakers in every era probably claim that the world has never been more uncertain. And indeed, that might well be true. And the world is not necessarily more tumultuous than in the past. But the nature of the risks that we are facing is unusual. Increasingly, volatility in growth and inflation will not only be driven by the business cycle, which we understand relatively well, at least some of you do, or even by the financial cycle, which we understand a little less well, but can at least try to anticipate and preempt. It will also be driven by a pair of major structural forces that we have next to no experience. Number one, geopolitical fragmentation. Number two, climate change. And I hope you don't mind if I step into the territory of those who study those two risks to try to explain to you how very special they are and how, as policymakers, we can address them. The fragmenting of a previously highly globalized world is a type of risk that advanced economies have not faced since the period after the First World War, and a rapidly, ever so rapidly changing climate is a risk that we have not seen for millennia. So, in my view, this pair of risks presents three very, very specific factors for us policymakers. First, they are particularly difficult to quantify and forecast. We saw this in Europe after the Russian horrible invasion of Ukraine, but more generally, political risks create various types of spillovers that are just hard to map ex ante. That said, there are certain studies that try to quantify the impact of conflict. I'll mention one, which, for example, estimates that for countries that are geographically close to a war zone, output falls by more than 10% over 5 years, and inflation rises by 5 percentage points on average. Another study finds that firms with greater exposure to geopolitical risk experience an increased probability of default, lower market valuations, and higher financing costs. Climate change is similarly hard to forecast, as is visible, for example, in the struggle the insurance industry is facing to accurately price climate risk, to the point where many of them are simply saying, sorry, but no, we don't insure anymore, as simple as that. An increasing frequency of extreme weather events means that claim costs no longer correspond to the historical data used to price risk. Last year set a record for the highest number of insured natural catastrophes yet. And climate change increases uncertainty about inflation. ECB research finds that, thank you, Luke Liven is here tonight, isn't he? Hi, thank you for doing that. So ECB research finds that extreme summer heat could ultimately push up food inflation in the euro area by between 1 and 2 percentage points. So that's the first factor. The second factor that makes these risks special is that they reinforce each other. A weakening multilateral order not only makes it more difficult to agree on collective climate action, but it also increasingly threatens to disrupt the flow of clean technology that is necessary to lower the cost and accelerate the speed of the green transition globally. With China now becoming the dominant supplier of solar panels, battery cells, and electric vehicles, we are seeing an increasing trade-off between faster decarbonization and greater economic security as countries seek to reduce their dependencies. Follow those developments by the day at the moment, but let's try to anticipate what the outcome will be. In turn, unmitigated climate change could strengthen fragmentary forces. For instance, an uneven distribution of extreme weather events may induce disorderly migration flows, straining international relations and encouraging policymakers to establish more barriers and promote more populism. One recent paper estimates that a changing climate could impel between 45 and 95 million working-age people to migrate over a short period of time. The third factor is that both risks are characterized by potential tipping points, that is, non-linearities, beyond which it would be very difficult to turn back. In the multilateral order, if it was to break down, history suggests that the opportunity to rebuild it again may be a long time coming. And indeed, every major overhaul of the international order, be it at the Congress of Vienna in the 19th century, or the Bretton Woods Conference in the 20th, which I'm sure you will hear a lot about tomorrow because of Mr. Toussaint being with us, was typically preceded and enabled by a major war. And if global heating were to reach a certain level, we may see irreversible transformations. For example, as warmer weather causes permafrost in polar regions to thaw, stored methane is released into the atmosphere. This causes further heating, and a self-reinforcing feedback loop emerges that is hardly irresistible. So what can we do to make our policies robust in such an environment? Well, let's think of the best case scenario. That would be for countries to carve out areas that will be spared from geopolitical rivalry, such as working together towards net zero, and to find ways to increase mutual economic security without necessarily fragmenting world trade. Do you all believe in that? Maybe not. So if we are more realistic, we must admit that with each passing day, this best case scenario looks less likely. The World Bank, informed by the WTO, finds that almost 3,000 trade restrictions were imposed last year alone, which is 5 times the amount in 2015. So policymakers need to be prepared for a second best scenario in which these risks do start to reinforce each other and typical tipping points get closer. And this scenario is likely to create 2 tensions for central banks that we need to address. The first tension is between what we can observe and what we can project. The last few years have shown that making policy based on projections alone is likely to be misleading. For instance, there were certain periods when recent inflation was the most informative signal about future inflation, and so the best policy was to overweight recent data relative to a necessarily uncertain forecast. But as major shocks passed, we saw forecasts becoming much more accurate. In 2023, for example, we saw a reduction of about 70% in the average absolute error in our staff projections relative to 2022, 1 quarter ahead. Relying too much on current data in this setting would have been equally misguided and would have led to policy falling behind the curve. So the challenge for policymakers is that it is not always easy to know in real time which regime you are in, especially when you are around turning points. And we cannot be changing our mind from one day to the next on what kinds of data are most important to us. For inflation expectations to remain anchored in an environment of structural changes and less quantifiable shocks, people need to be able to broadly predict our reaction function and know what developments we will tolerate and which one we will not tolerate. And that is why I have argued that in the future, we will need to have ex-ante policy frameworks that combine both forward-looking and current-looking elements. We need forecasts of the medium term, but we also need to be alert to the fact that available models have been educated using data from previous structural regimes that may no longer be valid. So analyzing current data and identifying persistent components allows us to account for structural changes and forecast the future in a more robust way. And this is essentially the approach that we at the ECB have been adopting. And I want to recognize and thank Philip Lane, sitting at our table and working hard with me on those issues and bringing all his intellect to those issues. So since March, this is what we've been doing. We deployed a 3-sided reaction function to make our decision most robust, a forward-looking component, that is our inflation projections, and 2 more current-looking ones, the dynamics of underlying inflation, of which we have multiple ways of measuring it and stripping it from less solid elements, and third, the strength of our monetary policy transmission. We have also made more use of scenario analysis to help us understand the risks around our projections if certain assumptions turn out differently. And this framework served us well in calibrating when to stop raising rates, how long to hold them constant, and most recently, when to start cutting them. And for the time being, we will continue to use it to set the rate path in this uncertain environment. That was the first tension. The second tension is between independence and interdependence. I promise not to be too long because I could be very long on that one. It is well known that central banks make decisions independently. But those decisions are interdependent with the actions of other authorities. When policies are well aligned, that interdependence can lead to virtuous circles which help all authorities deliver on their objectives. For example, increasing government investment to reduce energy supply constraints may lower medium-term inflation and make it less volatile. That would in turn warrant lower policy rates over time, encouraging more investment, and so on. But faced with existential risks like geopolitical conflict and climate change, it is natural for people to ask whether central banks can actually contribute more explicitly. And in my view, the answer to that question has two parts. First, the evidence we have so far suggests that the new types of shocks we are facing are likely to put upward pressures on prices, at least initially. One recent study based on data since 1900 finds that geopolitical risks lead to high inflation, lower economic activity, and a fall in international trade. And climate change is likely to initially appear as a negative supply shock, although over time investment in renewable, grids, and storage will lead to lower and more stable energy prices. So in this setting, I do not believe the ECB would be contributing to the European cause if we lost our focus on inflation and let inflation expectations drift upwards. On the contrary, we know that the public detests high inflation, and allowing it to become embedded in the economy would disrupt our politics and undermine all other geopolitical and climate goals. However, and this is my second point, as a changing climate and geopolitical fragmentation have implications for the ECB mandate, there is scope for action within our mandate. Let me give you 3 examples and then I conclude. The ECB now measures and monitors climate-related risks, and we have incorporated climate change considerations into our collateral framework. Second example, currency swap lines are vital instruments in helping to reduce volatility, but they too have a geopolitical impact as they can strengthen the dynamics of major international currencies. Third example, given the dominance of non-European digital payment firms, the launch of a digital euro would protect the strategic autonomy of European payments and monetary sovereignty, providing a fallback solution if geopolitical tensions were to intensify and exacerbate. So, policymakers today are grappling with these new kinds of risks, and we are not spared any new risk as the days go by. So while the best case scenario would be for policymakers to work together to prevent these risks from materializing, we have to be prepared for the second best world. That will be a world marked by higher levels of uncertainty and volatility, and it will create tensions for central banks that will have to resolve them. But at the same time, my dear Boris, I'm reminded of the words of the Croatian poet Anton Branko Simic. Man, be careful not to walk small under the star. I'm not going to talk about our star. But we cannot afford to walk small under the stars. And certainly this is not what we will do tonight, because as Boris said, if you give your speech between the first course and the second course, then we can drink. So, to Croatia and to the success of your conference, thank you very much.